The Mongol invasion of the Rus lands in the 13th century stands as one of the most decisive and formative events in Russian history. More than a military catastrophe, it was a civilizational rupture that reshaped political authority, economic life, social organization, religious structures, and Russia's long term relationship with both Europe and Asia. From the destruction of Kiev in 1240 to the final refusal to pay tribute in 1480, Mongol domination profoundly altered the trajectory of the Eastern Slavic world. Modern Russia, in many of its institutional and political characteristics, cannot be fully understood without reference to this period. Before the Mongol invasion, the Rus lands were a loose federation of principalities descended from the Kievan Rus, a medieval polity that had flourished between the 9th and 11th centuries. Kiev was once amongst the largest cities in Europe, with a population estimated between 40,000 and 50,000 at its peak, rivaling Paris or London. The Rus principalities were integrated into European trade networks through the Baltic and Black Seas, practiced Orthodox Christianity, and after the baptism of Vladimir in 988, and maintained dynastic ties with Byzantium and Western Europe. However, political fragmentation had intensified by the 12th century. Power was divided among competing princes in Kiev, Vladimir Suzdal, Novgorod, Smolensk, Ryazan, and other centers. This disunity would prove fatal when faced with a highly organized, mobile, and militarily innovative enemy. The Mongols, unified under Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, had created the largest contiguous land empire in world history. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, Mongol armies had conquered northern China, Central Asia, and parts of Persia. Their military superiority rested on discipline, speed, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and an unmatched system of mounted archery. In 1223, a Mongol reconnaissance force defeated a coalition of Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River, a warning that went largely unheeded. 13 years later, the main invasion began. In 1237, Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, led a massive Mongol army, estimates range from 100,000 to 150,000 men, into northeastern Rus. Ryazan was annihilated after a brief siege, its population massacred. Vladimir, Suzdal, and dozens of other towns were burned to the ground. Archaeological evidence shows layers of ash and mass graves in many cities dating precisely to this period. In 1240, Kiev fell after a brutal siege. Contemporary chronicles describe the city reduced to ruins, with only a few hundred houses remaining. The destruction marked the definitive end of Kiev's political primacy. Unlike Western Europe, which Mongol armies reached but did not occupy permanently, the Rus lands were incorporated into the Mongol imperial system. The territory became part of the Golden Horde, a successor state of the Mongol Empire that ruled the western steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas. The Mongols did not settle in large numbers in the forest zones of Rus, nor did they impose their language or religion. Instead, they governed indirectly through tribute, censuses, and the confirmation of local princes. This system of domination lasted for nearly 2.5 centuries. The economic consequences were severe and long-lasting. Many towns never recovered their pre-invasion population levels. Trade routes shifted southward toward Mongol-controlled centers such as Sarai, the horde's capital near the lower Volga. Craft production declined, coinage became scarce, and long-distance commerce with Western Europe diminished. Rus lands became economically integrated into the Mongol world rather than the European one. Tribute payments, known as vuikod, drained resources annually. Estimates suggest that up to 10% of agricultural output was extracted. Frequent punitive expeditions devastated regions that failed to comply. Politically, Mongol rule transformed the nature of authority. Princes ruled only with the Khan's approval, receiving a patent of authority called a yarlik. Succession disputes were often settled at the horde's court, encouraging brutal competition amongst Rus's elites. This environment favored rulers who could centralize power, suppress rivals, and efficiently extract taxes. Moscow, initially a minor settlement, excelled in this role. Its princes, beginning with Ivan I Kalita in the early 14th century, became the chief collectors of tribute for the horde. In return, they gained Mongol backing against rival principalities such as Tver. This relationship laid the groundwork for Moscow's rise as the dominant power in Rus. By serving the horde, Moscow accumulated wealth, land, and political legitimacy. Over time, Moscow absorbed neighboring territories, reduced the autonomy of boyars, and built a centralized administrative apparatus. Many historians argue that the autocratic tendencies of the Russian state, its emphasis on vertical authority, obedience, and coercion, were reinforced if not created under Mongol rule. The Mongol administrative model emphasized census taking, tax farming, collective responsibility, and harsh punishment, practices later mirrored by Muscovite rulers. The Orthodox Church emerged from the Mongol period strengthened. The Mongols were religiously tolerant and exempted clergy from taxation. As a result, the church accumulated land and influence while acting as a stabilizing force in society. Monasteries became centers of literacy, economic production, and colonization of the northern forests. The church also promoted the idea that Mongol domination was a divine punishment for sin, reinforcing moral authority while discouraging rebellion. This alliance between church and state would become a defining feature of Russian political culture, hence. Culturally and psychologically, the Mongol invasion left deep scars. Chronicles written in the aftermath depict the invasion in apocalyptic terms, emphasizing suffering, martyrdom, and divine wrath. This trauma fostered a worldview marked by endurance, suspicion of outsiders, and reverence for strong rulers who could provide protection. Russia's later emphasis on security over liberty and unity over pluralism has often been traced, controversially but persuasively, back to this formative experience. Militarily, Rus's forces adapted to Mongol methods over time. Cavalry tactics, signaling systems, and logistical organization improved under Mongol influence. By the late 14th century, Moscow was strong enough to challenge the horde directly. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army led by Mamai, became a powerful symbol of resistance, though it did not end Mongol dominance. Tribute payments resumed soon afterward, but the psychological balance had shifted. The definitive break came in 1480 during the Great Stand on the Ugra River, when Ivan III refused to pay tribute to Khan Ahmad of the Great Horde. The opposing armies faced each other for weeks without engaging before the Mongols withdrew. Though anticlimactic militarily, the event marked the end of Mongol suzerainty. By this time, Moscow had already absorbed Novgorod, asserted control over much of northern Rus, and adopted the title of Sovereign of all Rus. Ivan III also married Sofia Palaiologina, a niece of the last Byzantine emperor, reinforcing Moscow's claim as the heir to Orthodox imperial tradition. The long-term consequences of the Mongol period are evident in Russia's later development. While Western Europe moved toward feudal contracts, representative institutions, and early capitalism, Russia developed a centralized, service-based state with weak urban autonomy and limited legal protections. Serfdom intensified in the centuries following Mongol rule, culminating in its legal codification in the 17th century. Some scholars argue that the economic devastation of the 13th century delayed urbanization and market development, contributing to Russia's relative backwardness compared to Western Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. At the same time, Mongol rule connected Russia to Eurasian networks of trade and diplomacy. Technologies, administrative practices, and even elements of political vocabulary entered Rus through Mongol mediation. The very idea of a vast, multi-ethnic empire ruled from a single center was inherited by Moscow and later expanded eastward into Siberia. In this sense, the Mongol legacy was not merely oppressive but constitutive. Modern Russian historical memory remains deeply influenced by this period. The term Tatar Yoke itself reflects a national narrative of suffering and endurance. Russian leaders from Ivan the Terrible to Stalin and beyond have invoked the need for strong centralized power to prevent chaos and foreign domination, implicitly referencing the lessons of the 13th century. Even contemporary geopolitical thinking often reflects a Eurasian outlook shaped by the experience of Mongol rule. In sum, the Mongol invasion was not simply an episode of conquest, but a transformative epoch that redirected the course of Russian history. It destroyed the old Kievan order, elevated Moscow, reshaped political institutions, strengthened the Orthodox Church, altered economic patterns, and forged a distinctive political culture. Few events can claim such enduring influence across centuries. To understand Russia, its state, its society, and its worldview, one must begin with the shockwaves unleashed by the Mongol horsemen who rode into the forests of Rus in the winter of 1237.